All right, buckle up everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into one of the most pivotal and, let's be honest, controversial moments in American history. Sherman's March to the Sea.
A military campaign so bold, so impactful, that it's still hotly debated over 150 years later.
It's 1864, the Civil War is raging, and General William Tecumseh Sherman, he's about to unleash a campaign that will forever change the landscape of warfare.
What makes Sherman's march so fascinating and so unsettling to some is that it wasn't just about winning battles or capturing territory.
It was about dismantling,
Yeah.
really crippling, the Confederacy's ability to wage war at all.
And to understand just how radical this strategy was, we're going to be digging into excerpts from Sherman's March to the Sea, a military campaign in Georgia.
And let me tell you, this source doesn't hold back. This wasn't your typical march through enemy territory. This was scorched earth on a scale rarely seen before.
Scorched earth is a pretty stark term, and for good reason. Essentially, it's a military strategy where you systematically destroy anything and everything that could be of use to the enemy as you advance.
So we're talking infrastructure, supplies, even civilian property.
All of it was on the table. The goal was to cripple their ability to fight back, not just in the immediate moment, but for the foreseeable future.
And from what I'm reading here, Sherman, he really went all in on this strategy.
He did. Railroads torn up, factories reduced to rubble, bridges destroyed, even homes and farms weren't spared.
Was this considered normal military practice back then?
Not at all. In fact, it was incredibly controversial, even during the war itself. Many saw it as a barbaric tactic, a violation of the rules of war.
So Sherman was really pushing the boundaries here.
Absolutely. Sherman's march is considered by many historians to be an early and very brutal example of total war, or what some call hard war.
These terms really underscore the fact that this was about more than just military targets.
Exactly. We're talking about a deliberate disruption of the South's entire society and economy, a complete upheaval of their way of life.
This total war concept, it's pretty intense. It makes you think about the ethics of war, where the line is drawn.
It certainly does, and those are questions that are still debated today.
But putting those ethical questions aside for a moment, I'm curious about the strategic thinking behind all of this.
Was Sherman just going rogue here, or was this part of a larger plan?
Yeah, was he freelancing, or is this a directive from higher up?
Oh, Sherman was most definitely not acting alone. This strategy was conceived and endorsed at the highest levels of the Union command, including by General Ulysses S. Grant himself.
So this was a calculated move, approved by the top brass.
Absolutely. Grant and Sherman, they both firmly believed that to truly end the war, they had to break the South's will to fight, not just achieve tactical victories on the battlefield.
So it wasn't just about winning battles. It was about crushing their spirit.
Exactly. Sherman aimed to dismantle their economy, cripple their transportation, basically anything and everything that contributed to their ability to wage war.
And it wasn't just about Georgia either, right? This march, it had implications for the entire Confederate war effort.
Oh, absolutely. This march put enormous pressure on General Robert E. Lee in Virginia, forcing him to fight on multiple fronts and stretching his already depleted resources even thinner.
A brilliant strategic move. But let's talk about the logistics for a second. We're talking about a 300-mile march through enemy territory.
300 miles on foot through hostile territory. It's mind-boggling.
How did an army of that size sustain itself for so long? The source keeps mentioning these guys called bummers.
Ah, yes, the bummers. Picture them as Sherman's, his highly skilled and somewhat notorious foraging parties.
Foraging parties. So they were basically living off the land.
In essence, yes. They were responsible for gathering food and supplies from the farms and communities along the march.
That's pretty resourceful, but I imagine it wasn't exactly a welcome sight for the people living in Georgia.
You're right. It put a tremendous strain on the local population. And Sherman, he was incredibly methodical about it.
Methodical. How so?
He used census data from 1860 to meticulously plan his route.
Census data to plan a military campaign.
Yes, he specifically targeted areas that were known to have abundant agricultural production. He wanted to make sure his army could live off the land without completely depleting the resources of any one area.
So he was using data to wage war. That's pretty ahead of his time.
He was a brilliant strategist, no doubt about it. But as you pointed out, this take-what-you-need approach, it definitely created a lot of tension with the civilian population.
What were the rules of engagement, so to speak? Did Sherman just give his guys free rein to do whatever they wanted?
Actually, no. And this is where things get really interesting. The source includes excerpts from Sherman's orders to his troops, and they're surprisingly specific.
Really? Let's hear it.
Okay, so in his Special Field Orders, number 120, Sherman lays out some very clear guidelines. For example, foraging is permitted, but soldiers are strictly prohibited from entering private homes or committing acts of trespass.
So he was trying to draw a line to minimize unnecessary harm to civilians.
Yes, but it's important to remember that within those same orders, Sherman gave his army commanders wide latitude to destroy infrastructure.
Especially in areas where they encountered resistance.
Exactly. We're talking railroads, bridges, telegraph lines, anything that could aid the Confederate war effort.
So it wasn't exactly a walk in the park for the people caught in the middle, even with those rules in place.
It was a brutal campaign, make no mistake about it, and the scale of the destruction was staggering.
I'm curious, do we have any idea how much damage was actually done?
Sherman himself estimated that the march caused roughly $100 million in damage.
$100 million. In 1864 dollars. That's an astronomical sum.
It is. And if you adjust that for inflation, we're talking about billions of dollars in damage today. It's almost unimaginable.
Wow. And what exactly were they destroying? Was it just military targets, or did they go after civilian infrastructure as well?
It was a mix of both, but the strategic intent was always clear: to cripple the South's ability to resist.
So it wasn't just about breaking their armies, it was about breaking their spirit, their ability to function as society.
You got it. Imagine living through that, seeing your livelihood, your entire way of life being torn apart. The psychological impact of this campaign was just as devastating as the physical destruction.
It must have been absolutely demoralizing. And from what I'm reading here, the source doesn't shy away from the human cost either.
It doesn't. Refugees fleeing their homes, families torn apart, freed slaves struggling to survive amidst the chaos.
It wasn't just about buildings and supplies. It was about people's lives being irrevocably changed.
Absolutely. And that's why Sherman's march continues to be such a controversial topic, even today.
It raises profound questions about the nature of war, the concept of total war, and whether the ends justify the means.
These are questions that we're still grappling with today. There are no easy answers.
It's definitely a lot to think about. So Sherman reaches Savannah, presents it to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift.
A rather grim gift, some might say.
But the war isn't over yet, right?
Yeah.
What happens next? It's crazy to think about the scale of this whole thing.
Yeah, just picturing those massive columns of Union soldiers marching through Georgia, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. It must have been quite a sight.
It's one thing to read about it in a history book, but to imagine the actual lived experience of those who were there, it's just, wow.
It's a whole different level of understanding for sure.
So we left off with Sherman capturing Atlanta.
A major turning point in the war, no doubt about it.
And then he sets his sights on Savannah.
The crown jewel of Georgia's coastline, a vital port city for the Confederacy.
And his march wasn't just about capturing territory, right? It was about something much bigger.
It was about breaking the back of the Confederacy, crippling their ability to sustain the war effort.
That whole scorched earth policy we talked about?
But it wasn't just random destruction. Oh no, Sherman had a very clear strategy.
So what were his objectives?
Well, first and foremost, he wanted to cripple the Confederacy's economy and transportation networks.
Makes sense. No railroads, no factories, no way to move troops or supplies.
You got it. And it wasn't just about the immediate impact either. He wanted to inflict long-term damage to make it incredibly difficult for the South to recover.
A devastating blow, both physically and psychologically.
Exactly. And his second objective, this one was a bit more indirect, but equally important.
What was that?
To increase pressure on General Robert E. Lee in Virginia.
Ah, so it was a way to force Lee to divert troops from the front lines to weaken his defenses.
Precisely. By threatening the heart of the Confederacy, Sherman hoped to create chaos and disarray to force Lee to react.
A brilliant strategic move with multiple layers of impact.
And it required a level of logistical planning and execution that was, well, it was unprecedented for its time.
Which brings us back to those bummers, those foragers we talked about earlier.
Those guys were the unsung heroes of the march, in a way.
They were. How so?
Sherman knew that traditional supply lines wouldn't be enough to keep his army fed and equipped over such a long distance.
So he had to get creative.
He did. He basically empowered his foragers to live off the land, to gather food and resources directly from the communities they were marching through.
A bold move, and one that obviously had a huge impact on the civilian population.
It did. And as we talked about earlier, it wasn't always pretty.
But it was effective. And from what I'm reading here, it wasn't just random foraging either.
No, not at all. Sherman was very methodical in his approach.
In what way?
He used census data from 1860 to plan his route.
Census data? Seriously?
Yep. He specifically targeted areas that were known for their agricultural abundance. He wanted to make sure his army could sustain itself without completely depleting the resources of any one area.
Talk about strategic planning.
And when it came to disrupting Confederate transportation, his men came up with this rather ingenious, if slightly destructive, tactic.
What was that?
They would tear up railroad tracks, heat them over fires, and then twist them around trees.
Twisted railroad tracks.
It became known as Sherman's neckties.
I can see why. It's almost like a piece of art, a twisted, mangled symbol of the Union's destructive power.
It was certainly a very visual way to disable the Confederate rail network, and it sent a very clear message.
We were here.
Exactly. But while Sherman's focus was on breaking the Confederate war machine, we can't forget about the human cost.
Yeah, the impact on the civilians caught in the crossfire.
Those families just trying to live their lives, trying to survive.
It must have been incredibly unsettling, to say the least.
And it was a deliberate part of the Union's strategy. They understood that to truly break the South, they had to disrupt the entire fabric of Southern society.
To undermine their morale, to make them question whether the fight was even worth it anymore.
It was a brutal tactic, no doubt about it, but it was also effective.
And the source we're looking at, it doesn't shy away from those hard truths.
No, it doesn't. It would be easy to just focus on the military tactics and strategies, but it's important to remember the human cost.
The lives that were lost, the families that were torn apart, the communities that were shattered.
War is never tidy, and Sherman's march was a particularly brutal example of that.
Speaking of the people involved, the source mentions something that I found really interesting.
What's that?
Sherman's personal escort, the regiment that protected him. It was made up entirely of Southerners who remained loyal to the Union.
Yes, the 1st Alabama Cavalry Regiment.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. These men were fighting against their own countrymen on a campaign that was devastating their homeland.
It really highlights the complexities of the Civil War. It wasn't just a simple North versus South conflict.
There were divisions and loyalties within each side, and the presence of Southern Unionists fighting alongside Sherman, it just adds another layer to this whole story.
It does. And speaking of the Confederate side, the source mentions that the opposition to Sherman's march was actually quite weak.
Really? Why was that?
Well, Lieutenant General William Hardee was tasked with defending the region, but he was facing an almost impossible task.
How so?
Most of the Confederate troops had been pulled away to fight in other theaters, leaving Georgia relatively undefended.
It seems like a major miscalculation on the part of the Confederacy, leaving such a strategically important region vulnerable.
It's easy to say that in hindsight, but the Confederate leadership was facing some incredibly difficult choices at the time.
Yeah, with limited resources and multiple fronts to defend, they had to prioritize.
Exactly. And unfortunately for Georgia, it became a target of opportunity for Sherman.
And with relatively little resistance, Sherman's army was able to carve this path of destruction through the heart of Georgia.
There were a few skirmishes along the way, but nothing that could truly slow them down.
It's amazing how quickly they were able to advance.
And all of this leads us to the climax of the campaign, the capture of Savannah.
The grand prize, in a way.
It was. But the approach to Savannah was, well, it was a bit more dramatic than Sherman had anticipated.
How so?
It's December 10th, 1864. Sherman's forces reached the outskirts of Savannah, this beautiful, historic city, and they're expecting an easy victory.
Wow.
But Hardee, he's not giving up without a fight. He's entrenched his remaining troops, and he's flooded the surrounding rice fields, creating this almost impassable barrier.
Wow, talk about using the terrain to your advantage.
It was a clever move, but it was ultimately a delaying tactic. Sherman, ever the resourceful strategist, he comes up with the plan.
What did he do?
He sends a portion of his army south to capture Fort McAllister, which guarded the mouth of the Ogeechee River.
Why was that so important?
Because it gave Sherman access to something he desperately needed. Supplies from the Union Navy fleet waiting offshore.
So he outsmarted Hardee and secured a vital supply line in the process.
Brilliant, right. And with Savannah effectively surrounded, cut off from any hope of reinforcement, Sherman sends a message to Hardee demanding the city's surrender.
What did he say?
He offers generous terms, allowing Confederate troops to leave with their personal belongings.
That's surprisingly lenient, considering the circumstances.
It was, but he also makes it clear that if he's forced to take the city by assault, he won't hesitate to resort to the harshest measures.
So it was a carrot and stick approach.
Exactly. And it worked. Hardee, recognizing the futility of his position, he decides to evacuate his troops across the Savannah River under cover of darkness.
A daring escape.
It was. And the next morning, on December 21st, 1864, the mayor of Savannah officially surrendered the city to Sherman, presenting him with the key as a symbol of their capitulation.
Just like that, Savannah falls into Union hands.
A Christmas gift for President Lincoln, as Sherman so eloquently put it.
But as we've discussed, this gift came at a very steep price.
It did. And that's where we'll pick up in part 3 of our deep dive.
Well, here we are, the final leg of our journey into Sherman's march to the sea.
We've covered a lot of ground, literally and figuratively.
We've talked strategy, logistics, the human cost, and now we're at the moment of truth. Savannah has fallen. What happens next?
And this is where things take a rather unexpected turn.
Oh, how so?
You might assume, given the whole scorched earth policy we've been discussing, that Savannah, being a major Confederate stronghold, would be looted and burned.
That'd kind of be the logical conclusion, right?
It would seem so, but that's not what happened.
It wasn't. So Sherman just, decided to be merciful?
Well, remember, his primary goal was to break the Confederacy's will to fight, not to inflict unnecessary suffering.
Right. The whole point was to end the war as quickly as possible.
Exactly. And perhaps, having achieved his objective in capturing Savannah, he wanted to, maybe demonstrate a different side of Union victory?
A more conciliatory approach?
Perhaps. Whatever his motivations, Sherman issued very strict orders against looting or vandalism.
So no pillaging, no burning, no wanton destruction.
None of that. And his troops, for the most part, they complied. Savannah was largely spared the widespread destruction that befell so many other southern cities during the war.
That's a pretty stark contrast to the burning of Atlanta just a few months earlier.
It is. And it makes you wonder if Sherman was trying to signal a shift, that the worst was over, and that maybe, just maybe, rebuilding could begin.
A glimmer of hope amidst the ashes of war.
Perhaps. It's a fascinating aspect of Sherman's personality and leadership.
Mm-hmm.
He could be ruthless and relentless in achieving his military objectives, but he also seemed to understand the importance of winning over the hearts and minds of the Southern population.
If lasting peace was to be achieved, you can't just conquer and destroy. You have to rebuild and reconcile.
Exactly. But what about those Confederate soldiers who fled Savannah? Where did they go?
They didn't just vanish, did they?
No, they didn't. Under Hardee's command, they crossed the Savannah River into South Carolina.
Back into Confederate territory.
They would continue to fight for a few more months, but the loss of Savannah, it was a huge blow to their morale and their strategic position.
The Confederacy was shrinking, their resources were dwindling, the end was in sight.
The walls were closing in, both literally and figuratively. Now, before we move on, there's one more thing I want to touch on.
What's that?
The source mentions something called Sherman's Special Field Orders, number 15.
Special Field Orders number 15.
These orders dealt specifically with the freed slaves who had joined Sherman's army during the march.
The thousands of men, women, and children who had escaped slavery and followed Sherman's army as it marched through Georgia.
Right. And these orders, they've become a really important part of American history, almost legendary in a way.
What do they say?
Essentially, Sherman set aside a huge tract of land along the coast of Georgia and South Carolina to be divided up and distributed among those freed slaves.
So he was giving them land.
He was. Each family was to receive 40 acres of land to farm and make a new life for themselves.
Ah, so that's where the phrase 40 acres and a mule comes from.
Exactly. Though it's important to note that the mule part was never actually in Sherman's orders.
It wasn't.
No, it was kind of added later, reflecting the hopes and dreams of those freed slaves.
A desire for not just land, but the means to work it.
Exactly. So Sherman offered the land, but not the mules.
Still, it must have seemed like an incredible opportunity for those who had just escaped a lifetime of slavery.
It was a huge gesture, a glimmer of hope, but it also reflects the really complex political landscape of the time.
Sherman was a military commander, not a social reformer.
Right. His primary objective was to win the war, to defeat the Confederacy.
But he also recognized that the issue of slavery was central to this conflict.
And these orders, they were an attempt in his own way to address the needs and aspirations of those newly freed people.
It reminds us that the Civil War wasn't just about states' rights or territory. It was about human rights, the fight for equality and justice.
Absolutely. And that fight, it wouldn't end with the war itself. The journey towards true equality and justice would continue for generations to come.
Okay, so we've talked about the military strategy, the human cost, the political implications. But let's zoom out for a second and talk about the broader impact of Sherman's march.
The long-term consequences, especially for the South.
Sherman himself estimated $100 million in damage, and that's just a fraction of the total cost.
The impact was profound, both in the short term and in the long term. The march crippled the South's agricultural production, destroyed their already fragile transportation networks, and left entire communities in ruins.
A devastating blow to their economy and their way of life.
And this economic devastation, it had ripple effects that lasted for generations. The South, particularly Georgia, faced a long and arduous road to recovery.
It's one thing to read about it in a history book, but to imagine the actual lived experience of those who went through it, trying to rebuild their lives from scratch.
It really puts things into perspective. It's a stark reminder of the enduring legacy of war.
It's not just about battles and casualties. It's about the long-term consequences, the scars that remain long after the fighting has ended.
And that brings us to the question of why we're still talking about this, why Sherman's march continues to fascinate and horrify us even 150 years later.
It's a good question. What do you think?
I think it's because Sherman's march challenges our traditional notions of warfare.
It wasn't just about conquering territory or defeating armies in the field. It was about breaking the enemy's will to fight, even if that meant targeting their civilian infrastructure.
It blurred the lines between what we consider acceptable in war, and those ethical questions are still relevant today.
The whole concept of total war, it forces us to confront some really uncomfortable truths about the nature of conflict.
Exactly. How far is too far? What are the limits of military necessity? And when does the pursuit of victory become something morally repugnant?
These are questions that Sherman's march forces us to confront even today.
They are, and there are no easy answers.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember about Sherman's march to the sea?
I think there are three main points to consider.
Okay, let's hear it.
First, it was a brilliant military campaign, executed with remarkable precision and strategic vision.
A testament to Sherman's skills as a commander.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Second, it was a brutal and destructive campaign, with devastating and long-lasting consequences for the South and its people.
The human cost cannot be overstated.
It can't. And third, it's a campaign that continues to challenge our understanding of warfare, the ethics of war, and the enduring human cost of conflict.
It's a story of victory and defeat, of destruction and resilience, of the complexities of war and the enduring power of the human spirit.
And it's a story that continues to resonate with us today, forcing us to ask hard questions about the nature of conflict and the price of peace.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Sherman's March to the Sea. We hope you found it informative, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit unsettling.
And if this conversation has sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to delve deeper into this fascinating and complex chapter of American history.
There's always more to learn, more to explore, more to understand. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.